What's up, gamers? I'm Josh, and this is Copper Dragon Games. Today we're talking about information that you may be giving away to your players as you use the Foundry Virtual Tabletop interface. In a live, in-person game of Dungeons & Dragons, there's lots of information that you would keep in your DM notes or behind your DM screen that in Foundry Virtual Tabletop you may be giving away. I want to show you some key places in the Foundry Virtual Tabletop interface where players may be able to see a little more than you're expecting, so you'll be more aware of what they can see, and keep the mysteries of your campaign world a mystery until you're ready to reveal it. Let's get started. So I've got to admit, it's kind of a weird setup for me here. I've got two screens with the same map. One is in the actual Foundry Virtual Tabletop application. The other is what a player would see on their end. I think it's important to point out that in a game like this, where you're playing online and you don't have a physical Dungeon Master screen in between you and your players, that this interface functions as your DM screen. So, as good as you would be at hiding things behind the screen in real life, you have to be just as good at hiding things behind this interface if you don't want players to pick up on things that you weren't necessarily ready to reveal yet. A lot of that just comes with practice and experience with the software, but I'm hoping this video will help you overcome some of those obstacles that I have been just stumbling through on my own and revealing more to my players than I intended to until I realized later on, oh, they knew more than they were supposed to. Even though I haven't given up any major plot points or anything, there have still been a few times during my sessions that I know I was giving up more information than I probably should have. And in some cases, the information that I was giving up was actually incorrect, and we'll get to that later, but I don't ever want to mislead my players unintentionally. There are definitely times to mislead your players intentionally, especially when it comes to mysteries, but I don't want them to get the wrong idea unless it's my intention that they have the wrong idea. Let's start with the initiative tracker and talk about some things that players can pick up on from the initiative tracker that you may not want them to know. First of all, let's actually open the combat tracker and add some combatants to it. So this is what players see on their end over here. This is what you have on your end as a DM. I covered a bunch of initiative tips and tricks in another video, which I'll link above and below. What I want to make sure I cover here is those tools that help you hide information from players. The first of these is the little visibility toggle here. This is a really easy way of making sure your players don't notice that a foe is there yet. Maybe it's invisible and they haven't noticed, or maybe it's behind a wall and they haven't had the opportunity to notice. Whatever the reason, if it's in the combat but it's not in the initiative tracker, this is the button you want to use. It's also helpful to note that any creature that you have that is invisible on the board that players can't see, you see that just disappeared, will automatically be added to the initiative tracker in that invisible mode. So you don't have to worry about adding your monsters to the initiative tracker and them suddenly becoming visible. That's a plus. But once they're in the initiative tracker, these don't always match. So your monster could actually become visible on the map, but stay invisible on the tracker, and vice versa. This might be useful if the monster suddenly became visible, but you don't want the players to know which initiative count it's going to act on. You want to add some extra drama to that situation, not knowing how soon it will act. It might also be cool to switch that up and have the monster appear on the initiative track without them actually being able to see it, and that can raise the tension in the session and the combat as well. The next button that's close to this is the little mark defeated button. I tend to not use this very often because when a bad guy is gone and down and not in the combat anymore, I tend to just remove them from combat to clean up the clutter rather than marking them defeated and leaving them there and leaving them on the map. I like a cleaner interface, a cleaner scene without the defeated foes cluttering up the battle map. That's just a personal preference though. One thing I have been thinking ahead about is the idea that there may be a situation that comes up with a monster that doesn't stay down. Maybe it's a type of undead that doesn't necessarily stay down. Maybe it's a troll that regenerates and will stand back up a few rounds later if you don't overcome that regeneration ability. Either way, deleting the monsters from the map sends a clear signal to players that that one is done and gone. And if I ever start using a monster that could come back and I don't delete them, then I'm also sending a very clear signal to players that this one is not actually gone, is not actually down, and that they need to continue acting in order to make sure it stays down. To keep players from realizing that, I may go to using the Mark Defeated button a little more often in my games, just so that when I do at a later date introduce some monsters that don't stay down, my players aren't tipped off when I leave a monster on the map rather than deleting it entirely. Technically, you could leave it on the map, and instead of marking it down, you could just mark it invisible. But that doesn't actually help with the clutter on my end as a DM. It cleans it up a little on the player side because they can't see the monster anymore. But for me, I still have that token on the board, even though it's faded and not prominent. It's still there and a little distracting, to be honest. From here, we'll move over to the chat log and talk about how when you roll dice and do other actions in the game, some of the information that pops up there may be giving your players more information than you anticipated. One of the things that I love to do, and that I know many of my fellow DMs love to do, is reskinning monsters. We love to take a monster stat block for one monster and change the theme, change what players see, and it gives a whole new experience because that monster is no longer a generic troll, for example. It may be using the stat block of a troll, but in the game itself, it's depicted as some other horrifying creature that just won't go down no matter how many times you smack it. And that fear of the unknown and the unfamiliar raises the tension and makes the experience more enjoyable for players. This issue is very real to me right now because in a recent session that I was running, I had reskinned a monster and rolled for that monster's attack and realized that I had forgotten to change the damage type on the stat block. Now normally that wouldn't be a big deal. I would roll the damage, I would state it out loud, the stat block itself didn't matter because I know that that damage is necrotic or bludgeoning or whatever. But if the stat block says something specific, and that information pops up on the screen for your players that gives them information that you weren't anticipating them having. Let's pull up a monster stat block real fast and I'll show you what I mean. So when I roll this attack, players get lots of information here. I have better rolls for 5e set up, and so it's rolling twice. It gives them the exact attack roll, which can give away some information about how high or low the monster's attack modifiers are. But even worse, it gives two of them, even if the attack didn't have advantage or disadvantage. So even if that one roll was a little mediocre, they might be able to tell a lot from another roll because it was exceptionally high or exceptionally low. For example, if I rolled and one of these attacks was a 4, players would know that that attack is not very likely to hit a lot of them because you can't roll a 4 unless you have a pretty low modifier. On the other hand, if one of these rolls was a 35, they would know to really fear these attacks because the likelihood of them hitting every time is going to be very high. The other thing this reveals is the damage, even if it didn't hit. It gives them the number and also the type. In my case, the attack in which they saw the damage type that was misleading was actually a miss. The attack didn't even connect in the first place, and yet Foundry Virtual Tabletop was telling them what type of damage it would have dealt if it had connected. Sometimes those damage types are pretty obvious, but other times they're not, and you really don't want them revealed. So my suggestion would be to go ahead and turn off the public roles and switch back to a private GM role. Once you have it set to a private role, what players see instead of all this information is just the fact that you rolled some dice privately. In a real game, you'd be rolling these dice behind the screen, perhaps. You don't have to announce any of the information about that attack, except whether it hit or missed, unless that information is actually meaningful to that round. You just state the results of that attack out loud. You can, if you need to, reveal it to everyone, and then they can see the whole attack. But keeping it private until you're ready keeps the mystery of that monster's attacks and stats a mystery until you're ready for the players to know. So with that, let's look at the map itself. You might be surprised at how some of the perks of Foundry Virtual Tabletop are revealing more information than you expected to your players before you're ready for them to know about it. First, let's talk about doors. I don't have any on the map right here because this is an outdoor scene, but I'm going to add one just for kicks and to show you what I mean by something. We had to refresh the player screen before that actually showed up, but here we go. So in Foundry Virtual Tabletop, one of the features that is often pointed out is players' ability to interact with doors. Players can run through and open them, close them, and this is really cool, especially considering what most of us who migrated over from Roll20 are used to, which involved switching to a different layer, moving a drawing of a door out of the way, then flipping back before you could interact with anything else in the scene. This is just so much easier. However, one of the issues that I've run into as I've been running games is players moving across the map too quickly and opening doors and testing doors to see if they open and having their tokens open the vision to those rooms before I'm ready to describe them. So long story short, I make all my doors locked by default across the board. Even when in the game they're not locked, I just make those doors locked. This prevents players from opening them before I'm ready to narratively describe what's in that next room. The map itself might be very bare in comparison to the description that I'm ready to give. And players may open a door, look inside, see a relatively empty room, and before I've had the chance to describe the room's contents, they've already kind of dismissed it in their minds as unimportant. Locking all the doors ahead of time prevents players from just barreling through your dungeon and opening all the doors before you're ready to give them that little burst of narration to help them understand the real contents of a room or location that might not be portrayed very well on the map itself. If all your doors are locked, players will still know there's a door there, but they can click there and nothing happens until you're ready to let them through, at which time you can unlock it and then they can go through and see what's on the other side of that door. Another issue that's popped up for me is the ability for players to see where my cursor is. Sometimes this is a really cool feature because I don't necessarily have to ping a location to draw players' attention to it. I can reveal information about the game, like the NPC you've been traveling with starts casting a spell without giving any warning. What do? Or you notice there's a rustling in the branches of the trees next to you that doesn't match up with the wind that's blowing and rustling all the other trees in the area. It draws your attention to this side of the map. You glance in that direction. That's really convenient to be able to just move my cursor there and show the location of the thing that I want players to focus on. However, it can also give away information about where your bad guys are in certain situations. After a recent session, I had one of my players get in Discord and send me this message. And he was totally right. I had invisible opponents on the board, just like this invisible opponent right here. And you can see on my map, I'm just moving around an invisible entity. But if the players know that I'm moving around tokens for creatures that are invisible, they can make very good educated guesses about where those monsters are while I'm taking their turns. So since then, I've actually turned off this ability for me. I left it on for players because I want them to be able to very easily point out things and draw attention to things for me. But I don't want my activity on the enemy's turn to give away monsters that are hidden or invisible or otherwise not shown on the player's map. It's really easy to accomplish this. You just go over to settings, configure settings, Then open permission configuration and find the entry for displaying the mouse cursor. In my case, I want to make sure I turn them off for the DMs. And then save that configuration. And then save changes. And now my cursor is not visible to players, so I can move this invisible monster around the board wherever I want to, and players can't see where he's going. Much better. As far as maps themselves, I didn't find this out until far too long into my usage of Foundry Virtual Tabletop, but you can change the name of scenes in two places. The first is here at the top. For my own purposes, I probably want to name this something very specific, like the Dreamer's Grove. Whatever. That's actually a real location in my own campaign, but it's not this map. Anyway, I want to name it something very specific so that when I search for it later, or when I'm organizing my folders of different scenes, that it's easy for me to find and identify. However, the unfortunate thing is when I update this, it also saves it to the player's map. There may be locations that I want to name very specifically so that I can keep track of where they are in my organization here, but I don't necessarily want players to know the name of them until I'm ready to reveal the actual location they're in. They may be exploring 5 different locations on the world map looking for the one that is the Dreamer's Grove, and when they're exploring a specific map, I don't want them to know as soon as they enter that location that, oh hey, we found it guys, this one's called the Dreamer's Grove. Instead, you can go back to that configuration, and here at the very bottom is the navigation name. You can change it to something very generic like outdoors number 5 or whatever you want to call it, without giving away the actual location's name. And the real location's name will still show up correctly in your scene tab here. That's all we've got for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you saw, learned something new, or just enjoyed hanging out, I hope you'll click the like and subscribe links below. And comment below if you've got your own tips and tricks for how to make sure your players don't discover more about your game world than you're ready to reveal. I'll be back soon with more tips and tricks to improve your Dungeons & Dragons games. See you then.